In the volume issued in Professor Van Dam's honor in 2020, Leadership and Community in Late Antiquity, which came out with the Brepols published series Cultural Encounters in Late Antiquity and the Middle Ages, one can find a list of Professor Van Dam's selected publications. It spreads across 8 pages, written in font size 6, I must add. It includes 10 books, 26 articles and chapters, and countless encyclopedia entries, review essays, and book reviews. Out of the many publications that appear there, I will mention his book, Remembering Constantine at the Milvian Bridge, that came out in 2011 with Cambridge University Press, Rome and Constantinople, Rewriting Roman History During Late Antiquity with Baylor University Press in 2010, and 2 other books, Gregory of Tours' translation of the Glory of the Martyrs and the Glory of the Confessors in the series Translated Texts for Historians. Both came out in 1988 and helped familiarize a generation of graduate students with the early medieval culture and society. Today, Professor Van Dam will speak to us about the funeral and deification of Constantine. And we will add the handout to this lecture in the comment section below, and I have sent via email to all participants the handout as well. Please note, as you have noticed, that the session and the following discussion are being recorded. We will upload the recording to the different social media pages where you will also find the forum's past talks. We will have time for discussion after the talk, so we will try at Professor Van Dam's preference to have a more open discussion rather than a Q&A. Comments are encouraged, and you are also encouraged to speak with one another, so feel free to raise your hand, send me a private message, or pop it in the chat box, and I'll ask you to comment. And we, as usual, we advise you to ask questions, and again, feel free to do either one of those. So send me a private message or raise your hand. And now, that being said, Professor Van Dam, thank you very much for agreeing to be here, and the floor is all yours.
So, hello everyone. Thank you, Moore, for your introduction and for all your help in setting up this talk. Thank you to the Israeli Forum of Early Medieval Studies for the invitation to participate in its excellent series of lectures. And it's my pleasure to be with all of you today. My lecture derives from a larger project about inscriptions from the age of Constantine. After the emperor's death, dedications and other inscriptions described him as Deus, deified. Previous emperors had been consecrated, of course, but in an increasingly Christian empire, the meaning of deification will change considerably, perhaps starting already with Constantine. My lecture will present a series of topics: the description of the emperor's funeral at Constantinople in the life of Constantine by Eusebius of Caesarea, Eusebius's description of events at Rome, some of the coins and dedications in honor of deified Constantine, the possibility of local cults in honor of deified Constantine, and changes in the meaning and significance of the use of Deus to describe emperors. My discussion will combine close reading of texts with speculation about their significance and interpretation. And since these are all contested topics, I look forward to your comments and suggestions. So first, the funeral. And page 1, more if you go to the next slide. So here's just some basic information about emperors and dates. Constantine died in 337. Before his death, he had dedicated a shrine, perhaps a church, in honor of the holy apostles at Constantinople, and he had celebrated Easter on April 3. When he started feeling ill, he traveled to Helenopolis in Bithynia to pray at the shrine of a martyr. and then he moved on to a suburb of Nicaea where he was baptized. He died on May 22, the day of Pentecost. This information about the emperor's final itinerary is from the Life of Constantine, composed by Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea in Palestine. Eusebius also described the emperor's funeral. Soldiers placed his body in a gold coffin, escorted it to Constantinople, and put it on display in one of the rooms in the palace. First, military officers, court officials, and administrators paid their respects. Then senators and other ranking notables, and then crowds of people. According to Eusebius, this went on for a long time because the soldiers were waiting for the arrival of the emperor's sons. Constantine had already promoted his sons as Caesars, junior emperors. Constantine II in 317, Constantius II in 324, and Constans in 333. Constantius, who had been stationed in Antioch in anticipation of Constantine's campaign against the Persian Empire, finally arrived at Constantinople. He then led the procession of military units that escorted Constantine's coffin and placed it in the shrine of the Holy Apostles. After he and the soldiers departed, churchmen, presumably bishops and clerics, took over to celebrate a liturgy and led prayers. Eusebius's description of Constantine's funeral has long been a staple of books about the emperor. It is a vivid illustration of several large trends, from deified emperors to saintly emperors, from traditional imperial funerals to Christian funerals, from the centrality of Rome to the significance of New Rome, and of course, the rise of bishops. Now, my interest today is a bit different. Before we modern scholars propose interpretations of Constantine's final days, we should examine the source. How did Eusebius acquire this information? This question is especially puzzling because of the inclusion of so many significant small details about the emperor's final days and his funeral. Before Constantine traveled to Helenopolis, he first went to the baths of Constantinople. Before his baptism, he explained to the bishops that he had hoped to imitate the Savior by being baptized in the Jordan River. After his baptism, he declined to put on his purple robes. He died at about the noontime hour of the sun. And if I may insert a small digression here, those of you familiar with Eusebius's life might recognize that phrase. Eusebius had claimed that Constantine had once seen his famous vision of a cross in the sky at about the noontime hour of the sun. And these are the only two times he used that phrase. The emperor's coffin was wrapped in purple and displayed in the center of candles burning in gold holders. The funeral procession included both spearmen and infantry. In the mausoleum, his coffin was deposited on a high platform. Now, these are wonderful details, just too good to pass up. So what was Eusebius's source? One possibility is that Eusebius was present at Constantine's funeral. Eusebius was a bishop who traveled considerably, and he was already very familiar with the trip from Palestine to Antioch and through Asia Minor. He had attended a council at Antioch in early 325, the council at Nicaea in summer 325, another council at Antioch in 327, a council at Nicaea in 327, and councils at Tyre and Jerusalem in 335. In late 335, he was in Constantinople, where he delivered an oration about Constantine's patronage for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. In summer of 336, he was again in Constantinople, this time delivered an oration celebrating the 30th anniversary of Constantine's reign. The distance between Caesarea and Constantinople was about 1,600 kilometers. In 12 years, Eusebius had traveled between Caesarea and Constantinople, or nearby cities such as Nicaea and Nicaea, at least 4 times. Those round trips added up to 12,800 kilometers, or about 8,000 miles. At a normal traveling rate of about 30 kilometers, or 20 miles per day, those trips alone took over 400 days. After 325, Eusebius had often been absent from his see. One more trip in 337 would not have been unusual. The fact that Eusebius did not mention his presence at Constantine's funeral was not unprecedented. In his life of Constantine, he sometimes did insert himself as an actor. For instance, he noted that he had heard some stories, including the story about the vision of the cross in the sky, directly from Constantine. And he mentioned that the emperors had sent him some letters. But there were other important events that he described in his life, but without acknowledging his presence. The most notable was the Council of Nicaea. His description of the council in his life again included several interesting small details about the emperor. Constantine sat on a low golden chair. He delivered his opening oration in Latin. He then participated in the discussions in Greek. Eusebius was certainly in attendance because in a letter to his congregation, he described his participation at the council. But in the description in his life of Constantine, he did not even hint that he had been present. So not mentioning his presence at the emperor's funeral would not have been surprising. After Constantine's death, Eusebius would have had time to travel to Constantinople. Although Constantine's officers quickly sent couriers to inform the sons of their father's death, the funeral was delayed until Constantius arrived from Antioch, which was about 1,100 kilometers from Constantinople. Unless Constantius and his entourage traveled at exceptional speed, Eusebius could have arrived at Constantinople a few weeks later. If he had attended the funeral, Eusebius could have heard about the emperor's final days from participants, and he would have witnessed the lying in state and the funeral procession. Given his experience of delivering panegyrics about Constantine, perhaps he was invited to participate in the liturgy. In fact, some of his description of the deceased emperor in his life sounds like a funeral panegyric. In particular, the odd comparison of Constantine, whose death allowed imperial rule to multiply threefold with the accession of his sons, comparison to the Savior who multiplies like a grain of wheat. So my suggestion is that Eusebius attended the funeral at Constantinople. But if Eusebius did not attend the funeral, he needed a source or sources, perhaps oral from eyewitnesses, perhaps written. At least one part of the account in his life did come from a written source. So next slide, more. In addition to events in Constantinople, Eusebius described events at Rome. The residents mourned baths, markets, and entertainments were closed. People shouted acclamations. They erected a painting that depicted the emperor reposing above the arches of heaven. They hailed his sons as emperors with the title of Augustus. How did Eusebius acquire this information about Rome? Upon the death of an emperor, the Senate at Rome typically voted on his posthumous reputation, consecration or condemnation. Condemnation resulted in the destruction of the emperor's statues and the erasure of his name in inscriptions. Consecration resulted in commemoration of the emperor as Deus, deified. And in addition to the formal conferral of deification, the Senate's pronouncement typically announced various posthumous honors, such as the erection of statues and dedications, the foundation of a cult, and the establishment of a priesthood. And again, the Senate at Rome made these decisions. Note that in Eusebius's account of events at Rome, so this is in this slide and on the handout, number 1, Eusebius claimed that the residents of the imperial city acted in accordance with the Senate and people of the Romans. This Greek phrase seems to be a translation of the well-known Latin abbreviation SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus. And this is one of only 2 times Eusebius used this Greek phrase in his life. The other time was in his description of a commemorative statue of Constantine at Rome, which was derived from a document, probably an oration delivered at Rome to celebrate Constantine's victory in 312. With regard to the aftermath of Constantine's death, the use of the phrase suggests that Eusebius was citing an official document. In his ecclesiastical history, Eusebius had sometimes quoted imperial edicts, noting that he, or more likely his secretaries, had translated them from the language of the Romans, in other words, from Latin into Greek. These edicts had apparently been publicly displayed in Caesarea, which was a provincial capital. In his Life of Constantine, he likewise cited Greek translations of Constantine's letters. The decree of the Senate about honors for Constantine would presumably also have been circulated for public display, especially in provincial capitals. These sorts of official pronouncements were also read aloud in public by imperial officials. So Eusebius could have seen or heard an official pronouncement of the Roman Senate at Constantinople, if he attended the funeral, or at Caesarea. So my suggestion is that for this information about activities at Rome, Eusebius used a written source, a decree of the Senate at Rome. But notice too what Eusebius did not mention from this document: the formal deification of Constantine, the establishment of an imperial cult, and the appointment of imperial priests. These honors were also conferred on Constantine, as confirmed by coins and inscriptions. One explicit indication of formal deification was the minting of coins honoring the new Deus. So next slide, more. In his account, Eusebius described the images on a new coin depicting Constantine with his head veiled on the obverse, and on the reverse, the emperor standing in a chariot drawn by 4 horses with a right hand reaching down from above. The closest mints to Eusebius in Caesarea were at Antioch and Alexandria, which both issued bronze coins depicting the veiled emperor, the four-horse chariot, and a hand beckoning from above. In addition, the mint at Constantinople issued gold coins with the same images. And this is the image in the slide, which I'm using just because everything shows up better on the gold coin. So Eusebius's description of the images on these coins was quite accurate. But notice again what Eusebius did not mention about these coins. The legends on the obverse of the coins describe the emperor as Deified Constantine Augustus, father of the Augusti. Eusebius wanted to leave the impression that the Christian God was welcoming Constantine to heaven. The images were susceptible to this sort of Christian interpretation, but the legends were too awkward to fit in a Christian perspective. So Eusebius described only the images. Here is another oddity about these issues of deification coinage. After murdering many of their relatives, including Dalmatius, a cousin whom Constantine had designated as a fourth Caesar, only Constantine's 3 sons had become Augusti in September 337. Each new Augustus governed a specific jurisdiction. Constantine II, the Western European provinces, Constantius, the Eastern provinces, and Constans, the central zone, including Italy, North Africa, and much of the Balkan regions. And next slide, more. In the jurisdiction of Constantius, you can see on this list from Roman imperial coinage, in the jurisdiction of Constantius, deification coins were issued from the mint at Constantinople, the nearby mints at Heraclea, Nicomedia, and Cyzicus, and the mints at Antioch and Alexandria. In the jurisdiction of Constantine II, deification coins were issued from the mints in Gaul at Trier, Lyon, and Arles. And the similarities in the images and legends suggest a coordinated design. Images and legends on coins have been typically interpreted as signaling the policies and preferences of emperors and their courts. In this case, the coins were important for the standing of the new emperors. Not only were the sons honoring their father, but the legends explicitly legitimated their succession. According to the legends, Constantine was the father of the Augusti. This clear statement of their legitimacy was especially important after the massacre within their family. It is hence notable that no mints located in the provinces in the jurisdiction of Constans issued deification coinage commemorating Constantine as Deus and the father of the Augusti. Constans' jurisdiction included the active mints in the Balkans at Siscia and Thessalonica, and the mints in Italy at Aquileia and, of course, at Rome. The absence of deification coinage from the mint at Rome is particularly notable. Even though senators at Rome had voted to deify the deceased emperor, his youngest son was apparently indifferent. So if Constans was now ignoring Constantine's deification, perhaps we can even speculate on some unresolved tension between father and son. The inscriptions in honor of deified Constantine raise another issue by presenting a noticeable contrast. The location of the known inscriptions is exactly the opposite of the deification coins. All of the dedications to deified Constantine are located in Italy, the core of Constantine's jurisdiction. All of the known celebrations for deified Constantine are likewise in Italy, mostly at Rome. Italy was the region where prominent senators and their families dominated as office holders and landowners. And in many cases, senators seem to have taken the lead in honoring deified Constantine. So first, festivals at Rome. Next slide, more. In the mid-4th century, the senators who served as prefects of Rome presided over several annual festivals celebrating important dates in Constantine's career. A calendar of the festivals celebrated each month was part of a collection of illustrated documents compiled in 354 at Rome. The festivals you can see on the list, the festivals included the birthday of Divus Constantine on February 27, the two arrivals of Divus, understood as Constantine, on July 18 and 21, the accession of Divus Constantine on July 25, the departure of Divus Constantine on September 27, and the arrival of Divus Constantine on October 29. In addition, the festival celebrated other important dates connected to Constantine, such as victories over some rivals and the accession of his son, Constantius II. In contrast, the festival celebrated only 6 other emperors as deified, and one of them was Constantine's father. So one generation after his death, deified Constantine dominated the festive calendar at Rome. Senators also honored deified Constantine with dedications at Rome and in central Italy. Here are examples with some supplementary comments. Next slide. So first, Lucius Creperius Medallianus, the prefect of the grain supply, erected a dedication and a statue near the Forum Boarium in Rome. As an additional honor, in this dedication, Medallianus's praenomen was changed to the Constantinian name of Flavius. Medallianus may also have erected a dedication to deified Constantine at Ostia, 4.2. The dedication is now quite fragmentary, but Medallianus had previously been a curator in charge of the infrastructure at Ostia and Portus and a curator of the sacred shrines. At Fanum Fortunae, Lucius Tertius Secundus Asterius, the governor of Flaminia et Picenum, either appended or took credit for a dedication to deified Constantine. This dedication also described Constantine with the title of Father of the Lords. This is apparently a unique usage of this title, and its usage may have reflected the confusion of the period between Constantine's death in May and the acclamation of his sons as Augusti in September. As an additional honor, the city of Fanum Fortunae may have added Flavia to its name. Other dedications to deified Constantine were set up by groups rather than individuals. At Rome, the Corporation of Dealers in Salted Fish erected a dedication found in the southern part of Trastevere near the Tiber. At Plestia in Tuscia at Umbria, the municipal council erected a dedication engraved on a large block that might have been the base for a statue. Although most dedications to a deified emperor mentioned only his most common single name, this one used Constantine's full name. So if you look back at 4.1, 2, 3, 4, the dedications are simply to Constantino with a couple of titles. But this one used his full name, Flavio Valerio Constantino. Perhaps this dedication was erected again during the summer of 337 when the succession was still in turmoil, and Constantine was still imagined to be a ruling emperor. Perhaps the designation as deified, Dewo, was simply added to an existing dedication. In the past, scholars have cited some dedications to deified Constantine from the provinces. These dedications should be discarded as evidence. One inscription was at Arles, engraved on the front facade of a building that was a temple or a monumental entryway. Only half of the facade still survives. The inscription was displayed in large bronze letters attached to the blocks with pegs. Now only the holes for the pegs survive. In the 18th century, the inscription was reconstructed as a dedication to deified Constantine. A more recent, better reconstruction is as a dedication to Constantine and his Caesars, in other words, during his lifetime. Two dedications in North Africa should also be discarded. Next slide. In the past, the identical dedications, the identical inscriptions on two milestones on the road from Kilium in Byzacena were once read as dedications to deified Constantine. These inscriptions have now been better read as dedications to our Lord Constantine. As you can see, the opening of the text should be read as DN, an abbreviation for Domino Nostro, rather than DIV, abbreviation for Dewo. Look closely, this is almost an optical illusion. So the few dedications to deified Constantine were all erected at Rome or in central Italy, and soon after his death. Now, if the Senate's decree about the emperor's deification followed the traditional pattern, it presumably also honored him with the establishment of a cult and a priesthood. The explicit evidence for a cult and a priesthood is very limited. Next slide, more. The usual dedication is a famous inscription from Hispelum in Umbria. In this rescript, issued between late 333 and mid 335, Constantine and his sons, the three Caesars, resolved a dispute over the selection of priests for a traditional festival. It also agreed to a petition from Hispelum to construct a temple in honor of the Flavian dynasty and to change its name to Flavia Constans. Note that the temple honored the Flavian dynasty, not a specific deified emperor, and that the priests were associated with a long-standing festival, not a new imperial cult. In fact, obviously, Constantine was still alive. Inscriptions identify a few men who became priests associated with a cult in honor of the Flavian dynasty. The people of Hispelum, which changed its name to Flavia Constans, soon afterward honored a provincial priest who was also a priest of the Flavian dynasty, 6.2. At Rome, the corporation of pig dealers and butchers honored Lucius Arradius Proculus, a senator who served as prefect of Rome in 337 to 338, and a consul in 340 as a Flavial priest. These priests were associated with a cult in honor of the dynasty, not specifically of deified Constantine. Now, these festivals and dedications were all in Italy, but there might be hints of cults in honor of deified Constantine set up elsewhere in the empire. Here are two possibilities derived from Greek sources. Next slide. First, however, note that the Greek translation for Deus is Theos, typically translated as God, but in fact also used for deified emperors. A clear illustration of this equivalency is in the Greek translation of Augustus's Res Gestae, the first emperor's account of his many accomplishments. Augustus wanted his account in Latin to be inscribed on bronze plates set up in front of his mausoleum in the Campus Martius at Rome. A copy was also inscribed on the walls of a temple of Roma and Augustus at Ancyra, modern Ankara, the provincial capital of Galatia, along with a Greek translation. So as you can see in number 7.1, Divus Augustus was translated as Sebastos Theos. This translation might allow us to find cults for deified Constantine elsewhere in the empire. One possible indication of a cult for deified Constantine was mentioned in an oration by the Emperor Julian. In late 355, Constantius II had promoted his cousin Julian as a Caesar and sent him to northern Gaul to lead military campaigns. In late 356 or early 357, Julian composed an oration in honor of Constantius, in which he also complimented Constantine. According to Julian, veteran soldiers still remembered Constantine's generosity and hence continued to worship him as if a Theos, which is typically translated as a god, but probably in this case better as a deified emperor. And presumably Julian had seen this veneration in Gaul. Another indication of a cult for deified Constantine is in the account of the historian Philostorgius, writing in the later 420s. Much of Philostorgius's account has survived only in a long summary by Photius, Bishop of Constantinople during the 9th century. Since Philostorgius had supported a small, discredited Christian sect, Photius was quick to malign him as an enemy of God. Philostorgius claimed that at Constantinople, Christians were praying to a famous statue of Constantine that stood on a porphyry column as if to a Theos. This has long been a puzzling description, and Philostorgius was clearly criticizing rival Christians. But the sacrifices, the candles, the incense, and the prayers are reminiscent of activities at imperial cults in the early empire. So perhaps it is possible to suggest that a ceremony that had started out as an imperial cult had been eventually transformed into a civic Christian ceremony. My conclusion is that whatever cults there may have been in honor of deified Constantine and the Flavian dynasty did not last long. Senators and local notables in Italy may have advertised themselves as Flavian priests. Veterans were long loyal to the memory of deified Constantine, and perhaps there had been a cult at Constantine's namesake city. So finally, a few comments on the deification of emperors after Constantine. The historian Eutropius, writing in about 370, classified the emperors Constantius II, Julian, and Jovian among the deified. As a result, modern scholars have concluded that the formal deification of emperors continued through the 4th century and even into the early 5th century. In fact, the evidence for this conclusion is quite limited and most likely inadequate. After Constantine, no more deification coins were minted, and no other emperors were described as deified in the legends on coins. Coins are typically considered an official messaging medium from imperial courts. After Constantine, there were no more inscribed dedications to deified emperors in the dative case. Dedications are often considered a messaging medium to emperors from cities, corporations, and individual dedicators such as senators. In these forms of social media, after Constantine, neither emperors, nor cities, nor senators were broadcasting concern about deified emperors or their cults. However, in inscriptions, emperors were still described as dewi, although in specific context and usages. It is not obvious that these adjectives were now based on formal deifications of new emperors, or that they can support modern claims about the persistence of imperial cults. In other words, the meaning of divus was changing. One specific context was in the formula for dating a year by the names of the ordinary consuls. Next slide, more. Here are some examples of all the emperors classified as divi in dating formulas: Julian, Jovian, Valentinian III. Note that these examples include 2 of the 3 emperors mentioned by Eutropius. The common characteristic of these dating formulas is that the epitaphs were erected after the emperor described as divus had died in the year when he was holding his ordinary consulship. In these cases, divus apparently means deceased. The second specific context was genealogies. Next slide, more. Dedications sometimes honored Constantine's sons as the offspring of deified emperors. Here's an example of a dedication to Constantius II on a milestone in Spain. Note the full catalog of deified imperial ancestors. So his father, 2 grandfathers, supposedly a great grandfather. So deified imperial ancestors going back 3 generations, although the oldest ancestor, the Emperor Claudius, is fictitious. But of emperors after Constantine, very few were claimed as deified ancestors by other emperors. In fact, some of the claims were on behalf of non-emperors who were trying to enhance their lineage. For instance, 9.2, here is part of a dedication in honor of Stilicho, a powerful general in the western provinces. Stilicho was married to Theodosius's niece, and he came to dominate the emperor's sons after their father's death in 395. His daughters in turn married Honorius, one of Theodosius's sons, and Stilicho may have wanted his own son to become an emperor. But since there is no indication that Theodosius had been formally deified, in this case, the dedication was acknowledging Theodosius as Stilicho's distinguished ancestor. So in these genealogies, the adjective divus designated an ancestor who was distinguished or honored. This sort of transition in the meaning of divus in dating formulas in genealogies, of course, raises questions for us about how to translate divus in literary texts and other inscriptions. So here's my final example. Next slide, more. In the later 350s, the emperors Constantius II and Julian agreed to the restoration of a statue in honor of Flavius Eugenius, who had been an influential official at the court of Constans. Eugenius had previously received a commemorative statue, but it had been taken down presumably after Constans, his patron, was killed in a civil war. Now the emperors agreed that it could be erected again. The new dedication announced that Eugenius had previously earned the statue under Divus Constans, and that it would be set up in the forum of Divus Trajan. The Emperor Trajan had certainly been formally deified, and in the 4th century, he was still considered an exemplary emperor. But Constans, he had most likely never visited Rome, even though it was in his jurisdiction. He had defeated his brother Constantine II during a civil war. He had quarreled with his brother Constantius II over theology, and he had been hunted down and killed during another civil war. Constans was not an emperor whom the Senate at Rome might have missed, or his surviving brother might have remembered fondly, or a usurper might have claimed as a predecessor. There would have been little incentive to have him formally deified. So in this dedication, while Divus Trajan was deified, Divus Constans was merely distinguished or deceased. So these are all the examples I have for you to think about today. And here's a reminder of my major arguments, which I'm hoping you will comment on. First, Eusebius of Caesarea most likely attended the funeral of Constantine at Constantinople, where he could also have heard about the emperor's final days and death. His presence would strengthen the authenticity and reliability of the account of the funeral in his life of Constantine. Second, for his account of events at Rome, Eusebius used a copy of an official decree by the Synod at Rome. This decree conferred official honors on Constantine, including deification. Eusebius mentions some of the honors, but not deification, a cult, and a priesthood. Next, Eusebius accurately described the images on the coins commemorating Constantine's deification, but he ignored the legends on the coins that described the emperor as Deus. Next, Constantine was succeeded by his three sons. The commemorative coins honoring Deus Constantine were issued at mints in the jurisdictions of Constantine II in the western provinces and Constantius in the eastern provinces. No similar coins were issued from the mints in Constan's jurisdiction. In contrast, all the known inscriptions with dedications to Deus Constantine were erected within Constan's jurisdiction, but only in Italy and at Rome. Senators and cities took the lead in setting up dedications. Fifth, presumably there were local cults in honor of deified Constantine. Some texts can be interpreted to imply the existence of cults in Gaul among veterans and at Constantinople in association with a statue of the emperor. And finally, after Constantine, no more emperors were formally deified, and the meaning of Deus changed. Instead, Deus is better translated as deceased in dating formulas or as distinguished in genealogies. So my final conclusion is the first baptized Christian emperor was also the last formally deified emperor. Thank you very much for your attention, and I now look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Raymond Van Dam. It was so illuminating. And I had the pleasure to hear the talk a few days back, and I told you, and I'll tell everybody, that I was mind blown, and I thought to myself that I have to rethink everything I know about Constantine, which you found very amusing. So we open the floor now for questions and comments. Feel free to jump in. In the meantime, I might ask you, so you mentioned that this talk that you're giving us today is a part of a larger project. Could you perhaps share some information about the project and what you're working on?
Sure. The larger project is about inscriptions from the age of Constantine. It's not meant to be a complete compendium of all inscriptions. Rather, it's a whole series of inscriptions put and discussed in context. And the goal is to help other scholars who perhaps don't have the time or the inclination to look up all the details in the background on these inscriptions. So those of you who work with inscriptions will understand what I'm talking about. Inscriptions are published in many volumes, huge volumes. They're published in many journals, and it's very difficult just keeping track of everything. And the goal of discussing inscriptions is to construct new contexts for Constantine. And one preliminary conclusion is if inscriptions were our primary source for Constantine, we would rarely be talking about Christianity. It just doesn't show up.
Thank you. Our first comment is from Barbara Crostini. Could you say a bit more about the supposed painting at Rome, which you associated with the first SPQR document, where it might have been, and what was the iconography?
Okay, this painting is in Eusebius's description. It's part of the events and activities that he mentioned happened at Rome. So I assume that it was something mentioned in this document which I'm guessing to be the decree of the Senate, about the honors for the emperor. And this painting showed Constantine reposing above the arches of heaven. It doesn't say anything about where the painting was, any more details. But here's the context in which I interpret that painting. So in a conventional imperial funeral, there had to be some verification that the emperor had in fact gone up to heaven. And the usual verification already at the funeral of Augustus was an eagle flying up into heaven. And then someone would announce, oh, they had seen this sign, so the emperor was in heaven. Then the Senate could go ahead and vote on his consecration, his deification. Well, in this case, there wasn't going to be a funeral at Rome. So I interpret this painting as a substitute, the equivalent, the verification that Constantine was indeed in heaven. And with that verification, the Senate could go ahead with his formal deification. So that's how I interpret the painting, although I'd be curious if others of you have different interpretations, different takes on that painting. It's always been a bit mysterious.
Yaniv?
Yes, thank you, Professor Van Dam. That was really fascinating and thought-invoking. I was wondering whether you detect any changes in the term divus under Julian the Apostate.
Yeah, good question. So there are no dedications to Divus Julian. He doesn't really show up as Divus in inscriptions except in these dating formulas. But you know, a lot of this language about the sacrality of emperors, a lot of that language does survive and it gets carried over. And beyond that, I haven't mentioned, there is a wonderful book about the inscriptions of Julian, but I just haven't read it recently enough to comment.
Thank you.
Michelle?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for that really splendid talk, and vividly makes me appreciate all the hard work of working with inscriptions and making some sense of them. So I think your discussion of the funeral is really very provocative. I think it's very interesting, and I very much, there's a consistency in what you said about Eusebius omitting details that are problematic both at the funeral and later. So that's very compelling. So thank you. My question really, or my one thought that I had was, of course, Divus would change over time, and that the omission of the notion of apotheosis, it makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm wondering that after Constantine, we know that the Flavian cult continued in North Africa until the 5th century, at least we think so. It would make sense to me that the deification, concept of deification would change post-Constantine. You seem to want to say it just means they're dead, but the cult did continue. So what did people think they were doing then? Can you go beyond that? Because there were, we know today people have different interpretations of what a god or what they're doing. And so the clear continuity into the 5th century of the Flavian cult and the term divus strikes me as worth pondering. Do you have more thoughts about it? Your inscriptions you had showed simply they were dead, but I wondered if you could say more about that. And thank you again. Great talk.
So, Michelle, may I ask you some questions back? So there's two aspects there that are worth thinking about. One is that Eusebius might have omitted some details from his account at Constantinople. And I'm curious which details you think were being omitted in addition to his presence. I would have thought that this is something he might flatter himself on, being at the funeral. And then the second question I have about the continuation of these cults in North Africa. So my understanding is the evidence for the continuation of the cults is the existence of priests, but the priests are not identified with the Flavian cult. They're just called Flamines. So is that correct? Is that what you're thinking about?
I'm thinking, I haven't read it closely, but I'm thinking about the Flamines in connected with, and also the continuing, as you showed in the calendar 354, the worship of the dates, the birthday of the deified, etc. Which would have involved sacrifices, some would say, and other sorts of things connected with imperial cult more generally. So that there is some sort of imperial cult going on in which Constantine is still provoked or invoked, which would have suggested to some that there was continuity still in that notion of an imperial cult. What is an imperial? Yeah, what is imperial cult then? So yeah.
So the priests in North Africa are described simply as Flamines. I was looking again at this last night. It's not obvious to me that we can deduce from Flamines that it was the imperial cult, because there were priests with that title for other cults too. And the calendar of 354, which is your specialty and your wonderful book, I've always been curious about the continuation of those festivals after 354. So I think you're assuming that those festivals continued on. As far as I know, Symmachus never mentioned any of them, even during his year as prefect of Rome. So I'm wondering if 30 years later, they were in fact still being celebrated. And it's also pretty obvious from that calendar that emperors who had been deified previously had dropped out of the calendar.
Oh yeah, that I think that's quite normative. That we know that from the time of 2nd century on, they clean up the calendars. But there's no in the Feriale Cumanum at the end of the century mentions deified holidays for the cult. We don't have another, and even the calendar of Polemius Silvius mentions some of these birthdays. So we just don't have another calendar like it afterwards. So some holidays may have dropped out by the 390s, but I don't see any reason why, since we have the law of Theodosius at the end of the 4th century, stipulating that the birthdays and anniversaries be continued, but not on Sundays. That there is that would suggest to me that they are continuing. But Symmachus leaves out quite a lot from his letters. He's very, very selective about what he talks about. So I couldn't use the silence for that. But yeah. So about the Flamines, usually they're read, and I haven't looked at a long time, as examples that particular title would be connected with the imperial cult, and that's why that cult. That's the old article by Duval that I'm conjuring up from ages ago, but that would be the argument for the continuity, because that particular priesthood wouldn't show up unless it was used there. But, yeah.
Thank you for the additional references.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'll have to go and take a look at it again.
Thank you very much. Shaha?
Thank you very much, Professor Van Dam, for an illuminating talk, really. I wonder, first of all, it made me think about the fact that we're quite biased by hindsight, right? We know that Constantine came to be associated with Christianity to a very, say, extreme degree. But I wonder, from a contemporary perspective, so it's clear that if Eusebius is omitting certain details, that he saw tensions between Constantine's proclaimed or supposed Christianity and what had happened with his image later on. And I wonder, like, to what extent other people would have interpreted these titles or other gestures that were given to the deceased emperor, would perceive it this way. And also another question, I wonder how a deified ruler works with Christianity. I mean, maybe it's a bit of a naive question, maybe simplistic, but I mean, isn't that a problem? Or when does it become a problem?
So it clearly does become a problem. And Eusebius is already reluctant to talk about some of these aspects. So you mentioned Eusebius's agenda. Eusebius clearly has an agenda in the life of Constantine. And this is not a text that can be taken at face value. We always have to think about what he's trying to accomplish. His description of this coin is very interesting. First of all, this is one of the few literary descriptions of a coin that we have in an ancient text. So it's nice to know that Eusebius and presumably others were actually looking at these coins and checking out the images. Reading the legends on the coins was probably more difficult, but at least they were looking at the images. Eusebius's interpretation, by the way, has been very powerful. So if you look back at the handout, this is number 2, some of the entries from Roman imperial coinage. Roman imperial, I think the other direction more, that one, yeah. So if you look at some of these entries, I put down the entries for the bronze coins and the gold solidus in the middle, just to show that there is a common pattern, which seems to indicate that the emperors, their advisors, had agreed. But you'll notice how Kent describes the reverses. The emperor veiled, looking to the right in his 4-horse chariot. The hand of God reaches down to him. Kent simply took over Eusebius's interpretation. It's too bad that he included that. It should just say, a hand reaches down to him. And my guess is that people could interpret that hand in different ways. Your other question was about how Christians reacted to deified emperors. And again, I go back to this passage from Philostorgus. This has always been a mysterious description. Philostorgus wants to criticize other, or wanted to criticize other Christians for worshiping, he makes it sound as if they're worshiping Constantine as a god. Okay, Photius, whose summary we depend upon, had an agenda. Philostorgus had an agenda. My comment is that if we take this information and think about it a little bit differently, this is the word theos. If we translate that as God, that sets up one context. It's a context about Christian belief and doctrines and theology. But if we translate it as deified, that sets up a whole different context. And then we start thinking about Constantine compared to other emperors. So our translation of that passage, God or deified, influences our interpretation.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, there is a comment in the chat box by Dimitri. Thank you for such a profound presentation. That a cult had an eclipse by the new cult and then quietly passed away seems representative of late antique thinking, as if it were modeled on astronomical and calendaric skills in general.
So thank you, Dimitri. You should all know that Dimitri works on calendars and timekeeping in antiquity and the medieval period. So this is something he's very interested in.
All right. So if no one else has a question or a comment to, oh, sorry, Louise. To what extent can we a reaction against Eusebian accounts in a 5th century? Cyril of Alexandria, for example, seems to follow Athanasius' stories much more exclusively.
Excuse me, more. I missed some of that.
Sorry, I'll go back. Unless Louise wants to speak to us. I'll read it again. To what extent can we make a reaction, I assume, against Eusebian accounts in the 5th century? Cyril of Alexandria, for example, seems to follow Athanasius' stories much more exclusively.
So more, this is a new one to me, Cyril of Alexandria. So your suggestion is that he was reading and using Eusebius?
Louise comments that she has problems with her microphone, but I assume that's what she is asking. No, okay, the other way around. She does not think that he's using Eusebius rather than Cyril of Jerusalem and Athanasius.
Okay, I'm a bit lost here in the authors, but thank you for the suggestion, and I'll certainly follow up on it.
Okay. Barbara asks, does DN as Dominum Nostrum recur in other Christian inscriptions, and how does it improve on the concept of divus if Christians call Christ our Lord?
So nice question, because many of these imperial titles are clearly going to be taken over and applied to Jesus Christ. In fact, Dominus Noster sounds like the beginning of the Lord's Prayer, so it's clearly a standard evocation. So I don't know if DN, the standard abbreviation, is simply taken over by Christians, or whether it's common, whether it replicates imperial titles.
Okay. Shahar? Barbara?
Yes, I was just, I understood correctly that you go along with this rereading of that inscription. Is that right? So it's not possible that other inscriptions have also been misread, and they should be DN instead of divus.
Oh, sorry, you're muted.
So if we look at the other texts in 4, you'll notice in these cases, except the fragmentary text 4.2, in 4.5, but in 1 3 and 4, Devo is spelled out as a full word. So that's not an abbreviation.
All right. Please join me again in thanking Professor Van Dam for his wonderful talk. Thank you very much. So due to the holidays, our next meeting will take place in 2 weeks, so April 12th. Our next speaker is Professor Stefan Esders, Freie Universität Berlin, who will give a talk about medieval war guild, personal status, conflict resolution, and the barbarian law codes. In addition to this event, I was asked to remind our Israeli participants about the annual medieval conference, Medieval Now, happening tomorrow at Bar Ilan University. And we hope to see you then and again on April 12th. So thank you very much and goodbye. See you soon.